Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, President and CEO of BIO, and I'm honored to moderate today's panel of distinguished leaders, and I look forward to an engaging and wide-ranging conversation. I truly believe that while we are living through one of the most challenging times in our nation's history, these have also been clarifying times. Clarifying in the sense that we are seeing the best of the scientific community. We are seeing unprecedented collaboration and cooperation. We're seeing why each of us became passionate about science in the first place and why it's become our mission and our calling. Perhaps at no other time in human history has scientific discovery moved at such a rapid pace. We are engaged in an unprecedented response to the pandemic, one that has galvanized intellectual capacity, mobilized the passion and purpose of our community, and allowed us to organize around the most important scientific challenge of our lifetimes. The result and the pace of innovation has been breathtaking, and it will transform the application of science and our ability to be at the forefront of addressing the needs of human health and humanity. BIO is proud of our partnership with CLSA, and we are privileged to be able to work with such an outstanding and dedicated team. So let's dive in. In just 10 months, the biopharmaceutical industry has launched more than 800 unique drug programs to address the pandemic, including more than 190 vaccine programs, more than 210 antiviral therapies, and more than 360 treatments. Can each of you talk a little bit about what you are seeing from your respective areas of expertise and what you believe is enabling us to move at such a rapid pace? Dr. Desmond-Hellmann, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, I was really excited with your introduction. I'm like, count me in, count me in. That's why I went to medical school. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. You know what I have seen, I would say that some things, mostly things positive, and a few things that we could do better. What is outstanding is to see modern science and talent and resources brought to bear in collaborative ways to solve a problem. This industry is really good at solving problems. And the extent to which individuals under enormous pressure with the pandemic, they may be working from home, maybe be working under really tough conditions, the extent to which they sacrifice spare time, summer, family, all those things to make a difference just never ceases to amaze me. Not to mention the healthcare workers, the people who have agreed to be in clinical trials, all of that today is better than it's ever been because our tools are better. I mean, look at these two lead vaccines. If you'd have told me messenger RNA would be in the lead, I'd have just, a year ago, I'd have said, that's not going to happen. So that's outstanding. That is just outstanding. But even today, I was talking about here's what I'm nervous about. And I would put it into two categories. First is just, I would call logistics. How are we going to get the vaccines and the medicines out to the people in the hospitals that need them? How do we make sure that, and we used to say this with precision medicine, right drug, right patient, right time. Right vaccine, because there'll be people who should be first in line. And then there's other folks who shouldn't be first in line. So what does that look like? How do we pull that off? So the sort of infrastructure for public health when it comes to a pandemic is really lacking. And that infrastructure includes what we need to do to vaccinate over 300 million people just in this country alone, not to mention the billions worldwide. So first thing is just our logistics and infrastructure for public health. And the second thing is how we communicate and how society understands and accepts the measures that can help them. And those are the two areas where I feel like we have such a long ways to go. It would break my heart to see the kinds of innovations we're seeing and not see them get to the people who can benefit most.
Makes complete sense. George Skangos, you've been leading our COVID efforts at BIO. What do you think has allowed us to go at such a rapid pace?
Well, let me just echo a lot of things that Sue said. Look, the advances in science are incredible. You know, when I did my PhD thesis, and I actually thought it was a very good thesis, it took 5 years, right, of hard laboratory work. Today, it's a trivial 10-minute exercise for a high school student.
Does that make you feel about your PhD?
It makes me feel old because I was a number of years ago. And, you know, and the way we do genetics now compared to even how we did it, 10, 15 years ago is astounding. CRISPR is just a huge amount of difference. And you couple all of the advances in technology and the understanding of biology and with the understanding of data sciences, and you put that together and it's just unbelievable. And, you know, for younger people who are just starting on their careers now, I think the pace is accelerating and the rate is accelerating. So the first derivative is also positive. And so it's going to be an incredibly exciting time coming up. The other is the incredible dedication of people in the industry. So one of the few bright spots of the COVID pandemic for me has been to really highlight the motivations of the people who work in biotech and pharma. And people have put aside many of their normal business concerns just to work together to get going quickly, to not try and get every last dollar off the table at the beginning, to put huge amounts of effort into this without even knowing if there was a return on this. People are not doing this for the financial return. People are doing this because there's a pandemic and we can do something about it. And because we can, we have a responsibility to do that. And I think so many people in the industry have that attitude that it's really been heartwarming. And then what Sue said is true. People have been working 7 days a week, long hours under difficult conditions. And we've had cooperation from regulatory agencies, from the FDA, and certainly the EMA and the UK authorities as well, to work quickly and cooperatively with the industry. And so that's allowed us to take, you know, a 3-year process or maybe a 5-year process and condense it into a year. And it's incredible to see what's happening. And you know, and we're all working incredibly hard, and now there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think the vaccine data from both Pfizer and Moderna were incredibly encouraging. Still a lot we don't know about them, but what we do know couldn't look much better than it looks right now.
That's so wonderful. Well, I'm going to return to you to do a deep dive on that FDA question, but first I just have to say I feel your pain every time I think about pouring an acrylamide gel to sequence part of the DNA. I think about how easy it is for the students coming up today, which is as it should be, because they're on to bigger and more important questions. Alan, you have a very unique point of view across the industry. What do you think has enabled this rapid pace?
Well, you know, both George and Sue have mentioned it, in both directly and indirectly. The clients that I've worked with over many years are primarily smaller companies. They have capital constraints. If they're public, just sometimes getting attention from analysts and bankers and shareholders is difficult. And yet, as George suggested, the commitment once this crisis came upon us to examine and re-examine some of the product candidates that some of my clients were working on, and the realization that there may indeed be applications that could improve or impact other drugs that might be administered to COVID patients. You know, people just turned on a dime to start working on that. and again, one of the things that I've relished over many years, it's one reason why I continue to be more excited about doing the work that I do without the scientific credentials that Sue and George have, is that I'm dealing with people who, as George suggests, it's not the money, it's the potential impact on patients and science, and so the ability of the American biotechnology industry to move quickly, to realize that there are potential opportunities to enhance drugs and vaccines that may be available to patients. That skill has always been there in the 40 years that I've been involved with the industry, and we're seeing it in spades right now in terms of these both the smaller companies, and I give a lot of credit to some large companies that often moves very slowly, but in this case, the timeline has been absolutely incredible in terms of getting to the point where we may actually have a vaccine to administer in the near term.
It's wonderful. We really have seen the best of what's possible. And along those lines, George, you alluded to regulators and the role that they have played in this response. How would you rate their response, and what paradigms have shifted because of how they've responded to COVID?
Well, look, I think that the FDA has done an incredible job. They have been, number one, under significant pressure from the administration to approve things early. They have largely resisted that pressure. They've been sticking to, for making sure that drugs have demonstrated some efficacy and some safety, and on balance are safe and effective for patients to take. So I give them huge kudos for sticking to their guns under significant pressure. They obviously understand the urgency of the situation. They've been turning around documents way faster than they normally do. Maybe some days or a week or two versus some months. And, I think they've probably taken people off of other areas in order to be able to deal with COVID. But I think they've done a remarkable job, and they have a tough job now, and it's almost a no-win situation for them. And under all that pressure, I give them a lot of credit. Janet Woodcock, who is senior person in the FDA and has, I think, done a remarkable job for years, is now heading the Warp Speed Task Force for Therapeutics, and so is no longer involved in the regulatory decisions. But even without Janet, they've done a great job. So I have nothing but praise and for the FDA. The UK regulators also incredibly fast and thoughtful, as well as the EMA. So the regulatory agencies are in Europe and in the US have greatly facilitated the speed at which things are being brought to market.
So one other follow-up for you, George. We now have the benefit of having perhaps different tools at our disposal to fight COVID, or if not now, then in the very near future. How do you see monoclonal antibodies and vaccines intersecting, and how do you envision their use, for example, monoclonal antibodies before and after vaccines arrive?
Yeah, well, let's talk about vaccines for a bit, because suppose the vaccines really are 90+% effective. That's remarkable. And if you take a look at Moderna's data that they released yesterday, they had 95 cases in their trial, 95 cases of COVID. 90 of them were in the placebo group, only 5 in the treated group. That gives them the 94.5% reduction. They did say that there were 15 cases in the elderly over 65 segment of that population. And so we don't know, but they didn't break out how many of those were in the placebo and how many were in the treated population. So what we really don't know is the efficacy of the vaccine in the elderly. If they had no cases in the elderly, I can't believe they wouldn't have said that. Right? Or if they had 1 or 2 cases only, I think they would have said that. So and in any case, whatever the numbers are, with only 15 cases, there are going to be huge error bars. So we don't really know how well the vaccine works in the high risk parts of the population. Even if it does work the same in everybody and it's 90+% effective, the reduction in COVID cases is a factor of the extent to which you reduce the infections and the fraction of the population that actually gets the vaccine and how long the vaccine lasts. So it's a 2-dose vaccine. It does have side effects that are unpleasant. Don't seem to be real safety issues, but headache and nausea, fatigue, and other things. And so the question is, how fast can we get 70% of the population to take a vaccine like that? If 70% of people take a 90% effective vaccine, you get to 63% reduction in infections. That's about what you need for herd immunity to develop. So, and given the reluctance of people in the US to take vaccines, given that a lot of people will have side effects after the first dose and may not go back for their second dose, I think it's going to take, unfortunately, a long time for enough people to get that vaccine to really bring the pandemic to an end. And even if you reduce the infections by 50%, there are 20 million, cases, trend line for 20 million cases in the US. If you reduce that by 50%, now you have 10 million cases. Huge need for antibodies and other drugs to treat those patients who get COVID, and there will be, I think, for several years to come. And so the question is, how well will they work? I think the data so far, best data for the antibodies is from Lilly, right? And they had about a 70% reduction in the rate of hospitalization when they treated newly diagnosed patients. Again, there are small numbers, big error bars. I don't know. I wouldn't put that 70% in the bank yet, but whatever the number, it's clear there's a substantial reduction in the rate of hospitalization. So in that population, the antibodies work. A couple 100,000 new cases a day in the US. If you take, say, half of those, which is about right, that are in high-risk patients, either over 65 or patients with some comorbidity, it's 100,000 a day who really would benefit from the antibody. And Lilly can provide, they said, about 300,000 doses between now and the end of the year. So that's 3 days worth of need that they can provide. So the supply is going to be extremely limited, leading to obvious questions of who gets it and who doesn't. Regeneron probably will get an EUA for their antibody coming up soon. That will help. We should have our data probably in January. If they're positive, that will help. But I think for the next year, probably the demand will exceed the supply, even in the case of multiple positive readouts for the antibodies. In the hospitalized patients, Lilly's antibody was stopped. It was an active 3, the warp speed trial in the hospitalized patients. And it was stopped, I think, largely for lack of efficacy in those patients. Regeneron did not participate in active 3. They're doing their own trial, somewhat different enrollment criteria. And they recently stopped enrolling the more advanced patients in the ICU who have high dose oxygen needs. And apparently that were some safety issues. I don't have any insight into that, but just from what I read. But that trial is still going on in the early patients, and we're about to start a trial in the early hospitalized patients. So if the antibodies can have an impact, or some of the antibodies can have an impact in those early patients, that's probably the best use in terms of most lives saved per gram of antibody.
Very helpful.
So hopefully there'll be some efficacy there, either ours or Regeneron's or both. And we can keep a lot of those patients who are hospitalized from advancing to more serious disease. If not, then the main use will be in the early treatment patients. And depending on how well the vaccines work in high-risk groups and on the rate at which we can distribute the vaccine, there'll be prophylactic need for the antibodies in certain segments of the population, I think for some time to come.
Yeah, makes
So,
a lot of sense.
easy.
So Sue, you've had experience while at the Gates Foundation of trying to get vaccines into that last mile, in very resource poor settings. What do you see ahead of us in terms of our challenges in really making sure we have penetration in distribution of the vaccine or vaccines?
Yeah, no, first of all, leadership matters. I'll never forget speaking to a local leader in Nigeria who laughed when he told me that he and his sons had swallowed more polio vaccine than anyone needed. And the reason was he would go on TV and take the drops, and his children would take the drops. Leadership matters. Leadership matters. It matters what our leaders do. It matters what our leaders say. And so trust and confidence really matters. So on the negative side of that, and I have to say that it feels harsh, but even calling the program Operation Warp Speed was a negative. It felt to people like, oh, I don't want you to, this is serious. It seemed fanciful and maybe not careful. So I do think we all who are comfortable with science underestimate how much people need to feel soothed with vaccines. And so leadership matters. The other thing is that especially if there will be campaigning for a vaccine requires an infrastructure and follow-up, especially if there's 2 doses, which the 2 vaccines so far have 2 doses. That will change over time. And so I think it has to be something that in the US right now has not been our best thing. It needs to be cooperative, collaborative, and there needs to be a high level of trust. And so that's all going to take some time. It's interesting. I think, George, the way you characterized the vaccines and the antibodies was so helpful. And part of what, especially when we focus on high-risk patients, everybody cares about high-risk patients. I think focusing on high-risk patients is essential. Young people without pre-existing conditions who aren't at high risk, I want people to think of themselves as potential transmitters. Mm-hmm. I'm not as worried about me, although I'd like not to get COVID-19, but I really would be upset at myself if I gave it to my neighbor, if I gave it to my mom, if I transmitted. So I think one of the things that we've seen when I was at Gates Foundation is that sort of societal good, that sense that I'm taking the vaccine for me and my family and my neighborhood and my community, the more that you create that sense of purpose and community, the better vaccine campaigns go.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Is so important. And she is exactly right. And what worries me is so many people won't even wear masks.
Yeah.
That's a trivial thing to do. Right? And I think
absolutely.
that does not bode well for getting the vaccine into a lot of people.
Yeah, I'll quote Bill Gates. He's like, you have to wear pants when you leave the house. So just one more thing, put on the mask. Which I really, really agree. The other thing I might say, especially given how challenging it's been with masking and distancing and everything else, is getting a vaccine is good for the economy. And I actually think that's, for me, I try as a public health type person not to judge what floats your boat, right? Whatever floats your, if you're in like, okay, I want my local merchants to be, I want the bars to be open, I want the restaurants to be open, I want the stores to be open, get a vaccine, wear a mask. Much more likely that that will happen.
Yeah, completely agree. All right, well, we've had a small thing called an election recently. And I have a question for each of you. I'm going to start with Alan. President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris call each of you tomorrow and ask you 3 questions. First, what steps should our administration take on day 1 to help end this pandemic? Second, what steps should we be taking now to ensure we are better prepared for the next pandemic? And third, what can the administration be doing to ensure that America remains a leader in the life sciences and biomedical innovation? So what to do on day 1 about COVID, what to do to prevent the next pandemic, and what to do to maintain our leadership and innovation. Alan?
Well, it'll be hard for me to answer the question without referencing the horrible fiasco that is currently going on in terms of the transition effort in Washington. The notion that the Biden administration will be currently is unable to access the administration's public health individuals and understand what the Sue made the comment about the distribution plans and so forth, to be able to understand all that. All those things are making it worrisome as to whether or not the Biden administration on day 1 will be able to attack the pandemic in the way that I'm sure all of us believe should be the case. And again, the comments made about leadership are extremely on point. Leadership means both not trying to politicize success, to give a sober assessment of where we are, and to try and educate on a broad basis the scientific basis on which products, vaccines, or monoclonal antibodies may be approved, so that the portion of the population that refuses to get vaccinated, or frankly has been distrustful of taking a vaccine because the current president has made such a point about it, which causes Democrats and liberals to say, well, if Trump says it's good, then it must not be good, and I'm not going to take the vaccine. And I think there are so education, sober, honest assessment of where we are, transparency, all those things on day 1 will be incredibly important for the administration to undertake. And obviously, having a plan, a national plan for how the distribution will occur. You just have to listen to some of the public health people on any of the news programs, and one of the things they lament is the fact, comment about wearing masks that Sue just said, right now with cases spiking over the last few weeks, we've got some governors suggesting that their states do X and others say Y, and it's been absolutely clear that a national program is important, and invoking the National Emergency Act that will allow the administration to try and do a 50-state program. All those things, I think, on day 1 are critical. Beyond that, Michelle, at this point, I'm sure none of us has access to or read the the pandemic planning document that the Obama administration left the Trump administration. That's sort of gotten lost. There were plans, but trying to not just focus on day one, but to build into place, a national authority and answer to how we should react to such things in the future. That involves engaging different agencies in the federal government, not just NIH or FDA, but other agencies to participate in a broad-based discussion about it, and hopefully in engaging responsible members of the Congress, in the House and Senate, to buy into it, because there's going to be a cost aspect to it, which to date has not been forthcoming. And as the world, challenges of the broader worlds that we live in, obviously rejoining the World Health Organization and participating on a global basis, and not this notion of America first and America only, those kinds of things, and having dialogue broadly and taking ideas from other countries and offering access to what we're doing that's hopefully moving the ball down the field. Those kinds of things are things that the new administration will have to do. I'm confident that the president-elect and vice president-elect will have all the right ideas with the experts that they have already been consulting with. I must admit, though, I'm continue to be worried that they're going to have a lot of difficulty moving beyond the political environment that the present administration has created.
Very thoughtful. And Sue, what do you think? Day one to fight COVID, day one to fight the next pandemic, and to remain our leadership in biotech?
So on day one, I do think this transition awkwardness is a big challenge, and I like that so far Biden and Harris just seem to keep moving. So I keep moving. The task force is great. It's some very impressive individuals, so I would let them start. Keep doing the leadership things that President-elect and Vice President-elect Biden and Harris have done. Wear masks, distance, take the kind of precautions you're asking others to take, and use the states. I think the governors have already said congratulations and are ready to reach out to the new administration. And a lot of what happens, although I do agree with Alan, we should have a national plan, it happens through the states, especially things like distribution. So I would get the governors together and start having governor calls. And then use your assets, FDA, CDC, NIH, companies. There's a ton of assets. So I don't think, I'm sure this isn't rocket science, because other nations have done this. And so through WHO and other means, making sure that we're part of the global cooperation that can end this pandemic, I think is important. On the next pandemic, I'd get out the old playbooks, dust them off, and see what was in the playbooks.
Nothing new under the sun, huh?
Yeah, exactly. 3 things. One is climate change. There's at least some of what's happening in the animal kingdom and our own that's related to climate change. So climate change, primary health care, working, good, accessible primary health care system is good for pandemic, the next pandemic, and then public health infrastructure. Local public health departments have been starved to death. CDC has been starved, and that needs to get fixed. And then on leadership, investment, education, immigration. Those would be my 3.
Makes sense. George, I'm going to change it up on you, because time has flown by and it's hard for me to believe we're almost out of time. I could talk to the 3 of you, I think, all week. But I wanted to ask you one other question I want to make sure we get to. I believe it's incumbent on us to stand up when the integrity of science is politicized and undermined. And we've seen politicians on both sides of the aisle politicizing this issue, from the daily attacks on officials like Dr. Fauci to, frankly, efforts by the governors of New York and California who are calling for their own reviews of scientific data to duplicate the efforts of the FDA before their constituents would have access to an FDA-approved vaccine. How should we be thinking about undoing the misinformation and politicization around science of this disease? And how do we galvanize and organize the scientific community around this goal?
Well, look, that's a very interesting question. It also relates to the last one because social distancing has become more of a political statement than a public health statement. And we have to get over that. Look, so the integrity and the extent to which you can trust the FDA has been undermined, right, by the current administration. And I think the scientific community has to stand up for those agencies. NIH is working really hard. FDA people are really, these are government people, right, who have given their lives over to public service, who are now being vilified. And on the one hand, people thinking they're the tools of the industry, and the other, people thinking they're being roadblocked to introducing new drugs. So they, in fact, as I said before, I think are doing a great job. We need to give them the support. And there's no need, and it would be ridiculous, and I would resent my tax dollars being used for California to redo decisions that were made by the FDA or New York or any place else. Those are Democratic governors. I think certainly the administration can help there with those governors, and the scientific community has to stand up. Bio has to stand up, and pharma has to stand up and say we trust in the integrity of the process. That's a little self-serving, right? Because it will be viewed by many people on the outside as the FDA being in the pocket of the industry, and the industry is happy with the status quo, right? And so academic scientists have to stand up for this, not just people in companies, but the academic community has to join arms with the regulatory bodies and give them the support that they need. And that voice needs to be loud. And I think it's happening to some extent, but certainly could be strengthened considerably.
Wonderful. All right, so we got into the lightning round, very last round of questions. So you have all held leadership positions in a variety of dynamic organizations. You are mammoth leaders in our field. So my final questions for you today are, what is the best piece of management advice you've ever gotten? And more importantly, what was the worst? So Alan, you're up first.
Well, I'm the one usually giving the advice. So, and having clients tell me that I'm, off the base. But I mean, Michelle, it's the thing that I have always subscribed to in terms of the learnings that I've gotten over the course of my career and watching different companies respond, and that is that you must engage. It must, every problem that you try and deal with in terms of biotechnology is science has to dictate the answer as opposed to short-term or financial issues. With all the companies I've represented, there's certainly some that didn't deserve to fail but failed. Some that probably deserved it, but many of the ones that failed, I think, were ones where, because of financial constraints or the lack of support from their investor group, be it private or public, that they did shortcuts in terms of the clinical approach to a certain disease indication. And it's sometimes easy to say, do a more robust trial, do more patients and such if you don't have the resources to do it. But inevitably, when you make short circuit decisions and you think that you're going to somehow get a proof of concept, with a very small patient population that your own advisors tell you is not the way to go, I think you're doomed to failure. And so I guess the focus has to be on doing the right kind of clinical trials and letting science dictate what you do, as opposed to short-term financial decisions. One last thing I just want to say very briefly. When the pandemic first hit us, having lived through, 7 to 10 desert periods where companies couldn't get financed, I thought 2020 was going to be a disaster, and none of my clients were going to get financed. In fact, as I'm sure George knows from his own experiences, 2020 has been a relatively and maybe even a uniquely robust period. Why? Because I think with all the focus on the pandemic and the solutions, Wall Street seems to get, and certainly venture capitalists seem to get the concept that science does matter and good science is important. And so the one thing that I have been surprised about this year was the degree to which companies have been able to get financed because Wall Street and the venture community does understand that it's science that is our savior, if you will, and not short-term financial machinations.
I love that. That's tweetable. Science does matter. All right. So George, what about you? The best and worst management advice you ever got?
Right. I'm going to give you two short snippets, which I think were good management advice. The first is, do the right thing and keep patients in the center of your thinking, which I think is crucial to success in this. And the second was, be resolute during tough times, be humble during good times, keep your head down, do your work, and persevere. Right. So I think those are two short aphorisms that I think about. The worst advice I ever got was to stop specific programs because the marketing department didn't think there would be markets. And so you cannot let R&D decisions be driven by commercial people, right? You've got to focus on the medical need and the needs of patients and go there. And so I'll stop there. I think we're getting late in time, but give Sue a chance.
Wonderful.
Oh, I really
bring us
like
home.
this. So I'll also have two favorites. One is hire people better than you. Hire really the best person you can find on earth for jobs. And the second one is to ask for help. Those two things of hire great people and asking for help are two of my favorites. The worst advice is you don't really need very much sleep.
Also, words to live by or not to live by, as the case may be.
Not to live
Well,
by.
Thank you. Not to live by. Thank you, George, Sue, and Alan, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. It was an outstanding conversation, and I want to thank CLSA for this opportunity and for the work that you do year-round to ensure that our industry is able to grow and thrive in the state of California, my home state. So with that, thank you.